Right, we are live in 3, 2, 1. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the gaming industry. Before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we like to talk about games. And we're going fully broad for this one, right? We're not talking about just like one individual game. We're talking about the whole ass industry. It's 2022, start of a new year. Where are we at when it comes to, video games and
Well,
what the industry looks like?
to be fair, this is catalyzed by the announcement that Microsoft is buying.
Yep, this is indeed
Activision-Blizzard.
catalyzed by the gigantic, like monumental news that Activision Blizzard, in the wake of all of this, drama and scandal about Bobby Kotick, and the different kinds of sexual harassment that has been like levied against the company, are being acquired by Microsoft in cash for $70 billion.
So,
um
something that I think is very interesting about that was pointed out to me by a different podcast I listened to called Virtual Legality, is that price is approximately what the company was worth before the stock dipped after the scandal broke. So this is
there's some additional reporting that said that the news the this deal started taking place before the scandal. Apparently Bobby Kotick said that he wanted to keep Activision, he wanted to fend off this acquisition, and even sort of shopped the idea around, but by that point the scandal had broke and he had so little leverage and power among the board of directors that he really didn't have any other offer. All that comes from Jason Schreier, by the way.
okay. That's super interesting because traditionally Bobby Kotick, I haven't seen that, but traditionally Bobby Kotick's been a very strong CEO, right? Like the board basically stood behind him when he was like, "No, this is all bullshit."
Yeah. So I want to make sure that I'm getting all this information correct so that we're not spreading any misinformation. The quote from Jason Schreier says, in an interview, Kotick said the deal has nothing to do with the controversy surrounding Activision or calls for him to step down, and that Spencer reached out to him last year, which makes sense. A person familiar with discussions who was not authorized to speak publicly said Microsoft looked at Activision's situation, given all the negative attention and pressure on Kotick, and wondered if the beleaguered CEO would be willing to do a deal. Kotick initially didn't want to sell, according to another person familiar with the talks, and also put the word out to see if any other company would outbid Microsoft. But at that point, Kotick had little leverage with his board amid the ongoing public scrutiny with the company. So,
Yeah.
there you go.
Okay. No, I mean, I think that's kind of believable. Like in
Oh, and by the way, to correct this is Jason Schreier repeating information from another reporter, Dinah Bass or Bass, I don't know.
Okay.
But I just see that that's the person who this quote comes from.
Okay. Interesting. And the other thing there is you always have to take the person familiar with the situation but unauthorized stuff with like a grain of salt, which is understandable. But like it could
Yeah.
Regardless, right? It's huge news. It's like an amazing acquisition for Microsoft. Microsoft has Bethesda and Activision Blizzard, and a bunch of other smaller studios. I think somebody said that like when this finalizes in 2023, all those studios that AB has will like bring their total up to 30 under Microsoft, which is nuts. But yeah. I guess what are your initial thoughts about it? Since this is kind of like the piece du jour, right? Like this also comes in the wake of Zynga being acquired or acquisition announced by Take-Two, right? So for all the people at home that don't necessarily follow the minutia here, these are term sheets that have been agreed to, and they have to go through process, which includes legal process, right? Which potentially includes I think it's FTC action that could potentially block the acquisition, if it's too anti-competitive. If you want deeper dives on those kinds of things, I would again highly recommend Virtual Legality. The guy who runs that podcast, Richard Hogue, is a business lawyer effectively, and his bread and butter is mergers and acquisitions at a smaller scale, but he knows the ins and outs of that. So he can give the rundown on the legal side.
So the thing that is interesting to me personally is how much of this is recent, right? So something that I did is I went to the Wikipedia page for the lists, or the list of mergers and acquisitions by Microsoft, and you can sort by video games, right? And you can see that over the course, of the company, they've acquired maybe 20 or so, games. So not an insane amount, right? But just that, when it comes to video game companies, Microsoft has picked up plenty, right, over the course of its lifetime. But the crazy thing is how many of these are recent, right? So since 2018, they've picked up Ninja Theory, Undead Labs, Compulsion Games, and Playground Games, and In Exile and Obsidian, right? So that's 6 studios. That was in 2018. 4 of those were all announced on the exact same day. 2 of those on the same day. One in June, the other in November. Then in 2019, they picked up Double Fine Productions, right? Tim Schafer's studio, famously the Psychonauts, the Psychonauts studio. Then in 2020, they pick up Bethesda, Zenimax Media. Then 2022, now they have Activision Blizzard, and it's just like this to me just seems like a ramp, right? Where Microsoft is kind of seeing the blood in the water around the PS4 kind of outselling and just being the stronger system in that generation of the console wars of the PS4 and the Xbox One, and adding a bunch of like raw power to its lineup, right? And obviously, Microsoft has had big acquisitions from before then, right? Rare was a huge one. They acquired Rare in 2002. Lionhead
Bungie.
Studios, the Fable studio, yeah, Bungie was in 2000. Mojang was in 2014. Mojang, I mean, that news I remember was also Titanic, right?
Yeah.
Because they got Mojang for $2.5 billion. Which everyone thought was an insane amount of money, right? But now they're willing to shell out $70 million or $70 billion for Activision Blizzard, kind of at the drop of a hat, is a little nuts.
Yeah, I mean, again, another thing to point out there is we're calling it Activision Blizzard, but it's Activision-Blizzard-King, and that third name is probably a big part of this, right?
I think that third name is the most important part of this, actually. I think if I'm Phil Spector, right?
Spencer.
I'm pitching. I'm sorry, Phil Spencer. And I'm pitching this acquisition to the Microsoft board. The number one thing I'm saying is we've picked up a lot of good stuff, right? Bethesda is really strong. These stuff like Obsidian, Double Fine, these development studios are really strong, right? But the number one thing that we're missing when it comes to games is mobile, right? And so much of the mobile market share is dominated by the king in Activision Blizzard-King, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, getting one of, if not necessarily, we don't really know the numbers behind what's the biggest MMO right now, but getting World of Warcraft, getting Call of Duty, getting the biggest shooter, like those are powerful, like engines, right? But I think the thing that would sell this is getting Candy Crush Saga, all of the other pieces of that business.
I wonder if the Take-Two announcement like kind of put like fire under the ass of this deal, right? It's like that's the other big so mobile's a very weird space as far as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that like something like 85, it's like a standard Pareto principle thing, right? Like 20% of the games make 80% of the revenue or something, and for a long time it was like the top 3 games, and so there aren't a lot of big players. A lot of these are like kind of like one-off studios that got lucky, right? Like famously, the Flappy Bird guy just like was driven crazy by his success. And so like I don't even know who else is in that space. Maybe there's me being ignorant, but it's like Zynga and King, and like I don't know who else.
Right? Well, I think the other huge player in this field is Tencent. The number one mobile game actually is PUBG Mobile, and Tencent is the owner of that. They also have a couple of other games, right? Like Tencent famously also has Wild Rift, the League of Legends mobile game.
They own a majority stake in Riot, right? This is part of it, right? It's like Tencent's not an acquirable company, right? Like Tencent is bigger than like anything, right? It's like a massive.
What do you? So I mean, Tencent
company
is like Microsoft, right? Like these are.
I think it's bigger because it is like a semi-nationalized Chinese company, right? Like so, it's China, right? China is enormous, and it's got like state buy-in. So I think I'm pretty sure it's like one of the biggest companies in the world.
Really? See, I think Microsoft might be the biggest company in the world. I mean, like, I don't know. I could be wrong about that. I wonder what the biggest company in the world is.
Maybe I'm wrong. You.
Okay, so the biggest company is actually Walmart. Wow, that's kind of crazy. Wow, where does Microsoft even come in on this? I really overestimated how big Microsoft was, apparently. Microsoft is the 27th biggest company in the world, just under AT&T. But I don't see Tencent anywhere on this list, actually, unless it's like
maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so there's a couple of Chinese companies in here as I'm looking at it, right? But they are it seems like mostly like utilities. So State Grid is the second largest company in the world, which is just the nationalized electricity power grid for all of China. Then China National Petroleum, and China Petrochemical Corporation, who, you know, are number 5 and 6 respectively.
Yeah, I mean, I'm part of this is me speaking out of turn in that I'm not exactly sure how you calculate like total valuation, right? Because like, Microsoft, you said it was like 20 on.
The metric here, by the way, I'm on Wikipedia list of largest corporations by revenue, is like overall revenue.
Right. So actually, if it's 168 billion, it looks like. Apparently, apparently Tencent is 142 billion. And it's
Really? Why is that not on this list?
um
I'm looking at 142 billion. I see Glencore, I see China
yeah.
Life Insurance, I see China Railway Engineering Corporation. But I do not see Tencent, which is interesting, at 142 billion.
It says only companies that publish financial data report figures to a government agency. Maybe that data is technically, but it's publicly traded. Interesting. Weird. I don't know. It's also Wikipedia, right? So maybe something's like out of. Yeah, but anyway, it's a huge company. So you're right. Microsoft is bigger, but it is still unacquirable, right? It's big enough that it's unacquirable.
Absolutely, yeah.
My point being that that like there's Tencent, which is like already part of a mega conglomerate. There's Zynga, and then there's King, right? And so if Microsoft wants to get a mobile arm, it's got to do it, right? Like like, and so maybe this was like somebody was like, well, I guess we got to pull the freaking trigger before we get totally shut out of this market. But
yeah,
there's something you said earlier about kind of like the Xbox versus PS4. I guess the Xbox One in that generation. Also combined with like the kind of lackluster launch of the Xbox Series X, which was successful, but it's not like it's not like as crazy. Partially because Halo didn't launch with it, right? And they very quickly changed their messaging to like Game Pass is their big thing. This drive to acquire game studios, like I think, kind of fits with that, right? Like one of the big pivots for Microsoft when Steve Ballmer exited as CEO, and forgive me, I cannot remember the name, nor could I pronounce it if I remembered the name of the Microsoft CEO.
I don't actually know offhand. I do remember that it was it changed recently.
Yeah, effectively, part of his tenureship was pivoting Microsoft to be more cloud based, right? And so, and software is what Microsoft's always done, right? Like Microsoft.
Okay, yeah, it is Satya Nadella is the name of the current CEO, and he was the EVP of their cloud and enterprise group, which makes a lot of sense because that's where all the money was.
Yeah, but like, so Microsoft has always been a software company, right? It hasn't been like top to bottom like Apple is with hardware as well. And so it makes oddly it makes sense for Microsoft to be focusing more on software production for gaming, right? And also included with Game Pass, right? It's effectively becoming the Netflix of games, right?
Yeah.
It makes more sense for them to be doing that than like trying to fight on hardware, which is like a niche thing for them, right? Like Sony has like huge manufacturing arms, right? They do televisions and they do various other essentially other consumer electronics. Microsoft really doesn't. So, um, you know, gobbling up software companies while also what was it? I'm pretty sure Sony announced they were going to do a similar thing to Game Pass at some point. They've already got a little bit of that with the current Sony Gold or whatever, like
the PS Pass or whatever.
yeah. Well, it is their internet service, right? A la Xbox Live.
Yep.
PlayStation Plus is what it's called, and they have like it isn't like they had like a streaming service that was like iffy, and it wasn't. It was like an add-on or something, and then PlayStation Plus also gives you like 2 free titles a month, and stuff like that. So it's got like pieces of it in there. And I think they did streaming to the Vita from the PS4 or the PS3, if I remember correctly, as like a feature. So they've got stuff in process there, but it's not ready to go. And I think the Microsoft game Ultimate Gaming Pass is still technically in beta, but like you can play Crusader Kings off of it or whatever. And Microsoft having that all in house makes it much easier to keep on Game Pass, right?
Yeah, I think that is the big thing, right? This was something that it's funny because I actually think the analog here is Netflix, right? It is like the sort of war between Netflix and Amazon Prime and any other streaming, Hulu, right? Any other streaming service, and traditional movie and TV production companies, right? Like Fox or Disney or Warner Brothers, right? And historically, the thing for Netflix was they realized. So, okay, so the thing that catapulted Netflix to amazing success is they realized they had the golden goose and nobody else fucking knew it, right? Because but what they did in like 2006, 2008 is they realized that people were going to be able to be streaming videos of their, like of these movies. This was back when Netflix was mostly the mail service, the mail version of the service, right? And what they did was they purchased the rights to streaming for stuff like The Office or whatever, and built up that infrastructure because they expected it to be huge. And it was. And so they were streaming, thousands and thousands of however many hours of The Office that people were watching like every minute on the Netflix online platform. And NBC, I think it was NBC, maybe it was
I think it was
I think
NBC.
it was NBC Universal. And NBC Universal basically gave away those licensing rights for nothing, right? Because they thought that the thing that was valuable about The Office was like a box set, right? The DVD box set. So when they got those licensing rights, it was all packaged together and it was just like, "Oh, the secret here is that the most important piece of the puzzle are the internet streaming rights that they picked up." And so for a couple of years in the late 2000s, early 2010s, right? They just had really lucrative, really easy deals. And that's when people sort of caught on. And it was like, oh, okay, actually, I understand what the valuable part of this transaction is for Netflix now, right? Which is why we now are living in a world with a bunch of different streaming platforms, all of which have different kind of exclusivity. But the smart thing that Netflix did was they created their own in-house, they created their Stranger Things and The Witcher, right? They started funding the Dragon Prince, their own in-house productions to sort of compete with that. And now it is Warner Brothers and Disney who are creating their own streaming services to rival them, right? Disney has essentially pivoted almost entirely to a Disney Plus model, where they were once a feature film company that would have a streaming arm. They are now a streaming company that has a feature film arm. It feels like, and the same thing with Warner Brothers simultaneously releasing things onto HBO Max and onto theaters, which like people shit on them for that decision because by traditional metrics their movies are not doing very well. They're doing like poorly in theaters or whatever. But HBO Max is like overnight the most successful like new coming streaming platform, right? Compared to something like the NBC one is called, I think, Peacock, right? Or
Peacock, yeah.
Paramount Plus, or yeah, so Peacock and Paramount Plus have also launched, and those have much lower numbers, right? In comparison, and it's like, well, who can really say that Warner Brothers fucked this up when they just got like huge market share?
Yeah, so that's actually super interesting point to bring up because this goes back to their talking point that people have a lot about this ABK acquisition. Is kind of like and this is kind of where we're going with, I think, the discussing the state of the industry is how much this contributes to like Microsoft holding something akin to monopoly power. And in the
Mhm.
first place, I'm going to point out that I think with this acquisition, Microsoft claims it'll be the third biggest games publisher in the arena. And on top of that, it's also like obviously a very large tech company. So there's other factors there as well. But this point you bring up about Netflix, I think is ultimately right. Like you're going to have the giants, but I think that this also kind of provides the competitive pressure for like let's say Epic Games wants to set up its own game streaming service, right? Like it's already shown willingness to throw like absurd amounts of money around to like pick up games individually. Maybe they start picking up studios, right? Like, or like larger kind of like publishers that like traditionally just kind of floated over the studios. Maybe they draw them in a little bit closer or set up their own streaming platforms. As longtime viewers of the cast will know, I am generally skeptical of kind of narratives about kind of monopoly power or whatever. But I think
Mm.
I think we can look to previous streaming experience, and I'll admit that there are some differences there, right? Like places aren't selling out their rights to Microsoft like they were; they're getting acquired wholesale, so that's a notable difference. Do you have any thoughts in this kind of vein?
I do think that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Like Epic. So Epic is interesting because Epic is private, right? It's held by Tim Sweeney. He owns, whatever, 51% of the company. He more than 50% of the
Yeah,
company, right? But Tencent owns the rest of it basically. They have 40%
I think Sony
overall of the
has like
company.
10%.
Yeah, I just like looked this up, but I didn't actually see the
Okay.
numbers. I just know offhand that Tencent has quite a lot of Epic. But there are some like other real big, contenders, right? Like, it seems crazy to me that Valve, for instance, is still like an independent company, right? Like the most major PC gaming platform is this sort of kind of like it was just a video game developer that transitioned into a store service, and that's fine, that's great for Valve, right? That's obviously great for Game Newell, but it's a very different like market and a very different approach for someone like them. The thing that I wonder is how much games are the same as like movies and TV moving into a streaming service, like the idea that you might have your Amazon Prime gaming sub, you might have your Xbox Game Pass, you might be making individual purchases on Valve, you might be making, or on Steam rather, you might be making individualized purchases on the Epic Games Store or whatever. Or if maybe like the tea leaves aren't going to break out that way, right? Like there is also a world where the Xbox Game Pass isn't kind of the future of gaming. Um and and things don't materialize in that way. Like, so for instance, I kind of think that in another piece of state of the news, right? Amazon Game Studios has kind of repeatedly flubbed over and over again because their big gaming acquisition was Twitch, which is obviously huge, right? Like Twitch is a gigantic piece of what it means to be gaming, right? But like every one of the games that they have made, most recently New World, hasn't broken in the way that you can
Uh,
tell Amazon as a company wanted it to.
I was gonna say like by like all the other games they tried to put out, like New World is a success, which is kind of a problem, right? Because like they had I can't never remember the name of the game, but they had a game that they unreleased and they canceled
Yeah.
after they unreleased it, which is like mind blowing, right? Like, but yes, you can't just kind of like ship in talent. I think. Um, I'm actually super curious as to like what kind of has happened there because like they brought in industry veterans there, right? They didn't just like
Yeah, I mean they legitimately poached people, right? One of the things that was funny when all of the Blizzard news was releasing earlier this year was how many people got poached out of the Warcraft team. And it's just because Amazon was willing to pay them the money. They were
yeah.
willing to say, "Hey, listen, let's make that a six-figure salary. Come work for us," kind of thing, right? Um
So what'd be really interesting? I wonder if this happened, and like this isn't me saying that Crunch is good because I don't think it is, but I wonder how much of this is like Amazon treats its game studios like treats its normal software engineers, which you know I live in that space, right? Like
yeah.
I'm a mainstream software engineer. Um, basically, if you don't get things done on time, it can be a problem, but like you can also just like it's not like it's like most things these days are kind of like live services, right? Like you don't have to worry about having like Like if something's delayed, it's usually not even remarkable.
Yeah.
And on top of that, like you don't have like these big kind of like shock points, right? Like releasing a pared down version of like a business product or like a even like just a consumer level product isn't a huge deal. Whereas like a pared down version of a video game is bad, right?
Yeah.
Like,
And the crazy thing is that, you know, you typically don't have people sort of hounding for content in the way that you do with when it comes to video game, right? You know, so for instance, one of the things that's interesting is in a recent forum post on like the WoW forums or whatever, one of the designers mentioned that they were thinking about changing the Frost Death Knight, you know, tier set bonus, but given the amount of time that's left in the PTR cycle, right, they want to release the patch or whatever, they decided they're just going to leave it as is. The current bonus they have is functional, it works, it's not flashy, it could be cooler, but it's fine, basically, right? And on Twitter, one of the, you know, like what a player responded to that, it was like, this is, you know, this is awful, this is terrible, right? Like class fantasy is the most important thing in like Warcraft or whatever. You should hold the patch. Like, can you imagine, right? Like holding an entire content patch so that one spec out of 36 can get a changed 2-piece set bonus or whatever, right? And part of that whole, you know, like apparatus, nobody has that kind of conversation about, you know, like releasing like the next functionality update of a random, you know, application, right? You know,
yeah.
I probably spend just as much time in Adobe products, right? Like Adobe Premiere or Photoshop or whatever. But like, I don't pay attention to the release schedule. I don't know what the fuck is coming in the patch notes of Adobe Premiere 2022. You know what I mean? Like, it just kind of happens when it happens. But with Warcraft, you know, and just as one example, all the games do this, right? Any game, people, the moment you have eyes on what is over the horizon of the next thing, people are going to be paying attention and talking about that. And you have this whole ecosystem of streamers and content creators on YouTube talking, oh, what's in the new patch for whatever it is, Fortnite, League, you know, Warcraft, any of these huge gaming franchises. And I think that is a fundamentally unique thing about video games. When it comes to existing in this kind of corner of tech corporations.
Yeah, imagine if like 2 weeks after 9.2 comes out, they updated the set bonus to something flashier, right? Like without any warning, just kind of like, oh, this is a new feature, right? Like people would like lose their fucking minds, right? Like,
Yeah, that's true. And you have people complaining about like the content drought. You know, like nobody is complaining about a content drought when it comes to an Adobe product. My Adobe Premiere 2021 works just fine, you know, and I'm happy to be using it. There's probably bugs in there. It's bugs that I've found. There's functionality that I'd like to see. You know what I mean? But I don't care. There's no content drought for Adobe Premiere, right? But like the minute, you know, you're done with the current raid, right? Or you farmed enough rares in Korthia, now all of a sudden you're complaining that there's this content drought in like in something like WoW, right? Or you're at the end of a season in League of Legends, right? Or, you know, you're waiting for the next Call of Duty to come out because you know that, you know, it's been 6 months and you've already gotten your 1,000 hours in Warzone, you know,
all the
for the
gold skins.
season. Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
right? Like, I just feel like that is a completely unique thing when it comes to video games, and it puts so much extra pressure on developers to get stuff out and get it right. Especially because, and I mean, this is the part that affects me the most. Players don't have a good understanding or window into this, right? You know, because they don't think of, you know, so for instance, when if I make an announcement, right? If I'm going to make an announcement that like something is delayed, right? Or that we haven't settled on like a release date yet. We actually probably have a release date in mind. It's just that we know that these things are flexible, right? And things could change and we don't want to actually nail down when this is going to come out. Because the last thing I want to do is go, "Hey guys, sorry, this is actually going to be 3 weeks later," right? Um but players don't have a great sense for that kind of thing, and they don't really think of, you know, like the people making the games as, you know, in the same way that they would think of a waiter at a restaurant, right? When I'm at a restaurant and there's a waiter there, right? Like I understand that's a person working a job, but for some reason I don't get the sense that people have that understanding of game developers, right? When uh they announced on the WoW forums that the PTR wasn't going to be updated. Like the last PTR build went up on December 14th and it wasn't going to be updated for a couple of weeks. Well, obviously the answer is because it's the holidays, right? And a bunch of people are going to take a bunch of time off to go do the holidays things. But you have people on the forums who are legitimately like, this is bullshit. Because they don't conceive of like game developers as individual people that have jobs.
Yeah, I also wonder how much of that is just kind of like this kind of assumption that there's like some amount of bullshit, some amount of like variable bullshit in between code actually being done and like us seeing it, which is true to a certain extent, right? But like, be like this was much more true like when games went gold, like back in the even though they still do, but like obviously patches don't follow that same thing.
Mhm.
I wonder how much of this people just being like, well, the programmers are probably already done. It's just you not like printing CDs fast enough or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's also I mean, for us, it's almost always bug reports, right?
Yeah.
Or in my experience, right? What normally happens is you content lock on a thing. You say, okay, this is the patch is solid. Maybe this is a month out or whatever. But then you take that final patch and you QA the fuck out of it to make sure that there are no bugs that aren't going to be hitting live. This is also and this is just as true for big companies as far as I understand it as for small companies, right? What tends to happen is you get a PTR build up and it slowly picks up all of the content of a patch, but then maybe 2 or 3 weeks before that patch goes live, there's no more content, right? Maybe there's tuning, maybe there's numbers stuff, but it's not like you are seeing items for the first time, right? All of the items are in the build. It is just now, hey, maybe a couple of these, we might tune this up, tune that down, we might scooch around the numbers, we might fix bugs in the quests, but like all the quests are in there essentially.
Yeah. So this
So
is super interesting too because like obviously video games don't have any concept of continuous integration, which is like a big thing at like normal tech companies, right? Which is like I write code, it passes tests, and then immediately hits production, right? Um,
really?
this is a big thing for like startups because like
Okay.
at bigger companies a bigger like full disclosure, I don't think I've ever said this in the cast, but I work for Google, and
Mhm.
like if Google search goes down for like more than 5 minutes, it's a news story, right? So they've got
Right.
like much more stringent
Oh, I
policies
see.
around
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
production, but like previous companies I've worked at have had continuous integration, and it kind of like if there's a problem, it's not great, but it's fine, right? Like, you have someone on call to like be able to revert changes if there's a problem, but you don't slow down the pace of production just to kind of like maybe catch some of the stuff because a lot of like startup cultures kind of move fast and break things type stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but kind of also along those lines, um, is oh, I'm sorry, I just lost what I was gonna say. We were talking about
New
um,
World?
no,
That was the genesis of all of this,
yeah,
I think.
yeah, yeah. We were talking. Oh, the balancing aspect, right? This is
Right.
another thing that is very unique to games, right? Like in a consumer software product, right? A new feature is like almost always good. Like you'll get some bitching about like layout changes or whatever, right? But no one is going to get
Oh, yeah.
mad that like let's take Photoshop, right? No one's going to get mad that fucking lasso is like OP as compared to like rectangle select, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
like you could make the Death Knight set piece better probably pretty easily, but like people will be mad if that makes them like strictly better than say like a rogue or whatever, right? Like if it makes
Yeah.
them too powerful, which is like a unique problem kind of in that space. Um,
Yeah, and I think that problem, the overall consolidation of this stuff is exactly what hit Amazon, right? Which was they did move fast and they broke a lot of things, but you can't do that in games, right? They found a gold duping bug and then they took the game offline to stop the gold duping bug from happening, and then the fixed version had a completely different new gold duping bug that players immediately found and exploited. And now and the worst part is all of the duplicated gold is entirely in the system now, right? Like it's super saturated and there's just like absolutely no way to come back from something like that, right? And the whole foundation of your game can get ruined by that. Whereas, it's not like the foundation of my Adobe Premiere is ever going to get ruined by something along those lines, right? You know, um And I just think that is like the maybe the culprit here for what happened with Amazon Game Studios and New World. I also think that part of it is just a philosophy thing, right? Like New World was famously a PvP only, you know, the alpha when the or what it was either the
It was
alpha or the
originally
closed
conceived
beta.
as a PvP only thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah. So when the alpha or the closed beta, whichever one, went live and it was PvP only, you know, it got the traction that they wanted among like the enthusiasts who say that that's the kind of game that they want. But that crowd is just a lot smaller than they expected, right?
yeah.
And you know, you have a lot of normal people who just want to sit there and like do quests and farm fucking mobs or whatever, right? And when Amazon tried to pivot to pick those people up, we talked about this in our New World episode, right? Like they essentially just created a bunch of procedurally generated bullshit that was less fun and interesting to deal with, right? And that it turns out it's actually kind of hard and unique to make a good daily or you know, a good world quest essentially. Um,
Yeah, like design by committee type stuff, right? Like,
yeah.
we need to pivot to capture the theme park enthusiast, which is like, I mean, theme park MMO style is what I mean
Mhm.
better. Like maybe they might have been able to succeed right on the PvP front, right? Like there are a couple of smaller games in that, like Crowfall
Yep.
is in that space, and I think it's surviving. I don't think it's doing gangbusters or anything, but like it's going.
I do. I believe it that it's surviving. And the reason I believe that it's surviving is because you know it's not an Amazon company, right? Who's shelling out tons and tons of money to make that level of product, right? You know, if you're this is the whole business model for indie games, basically, right? I don't need to put out the most popular game on the fucking market, right? When Grime released, and Grime is the biggest game that we've ever released. You know, it was at the top of new and trending on Steam for a couple of days, which was, you know, that's huge. That's big for us. And that tends to happen. Anytime we release a game, it tends to be at the top of new and trending for, you know, a couple of days, right? Um, but you know, that's not a gangbusters thing, right? Like being the top of Steam's new and trending page for a couple of days, that's good, obviously, but it's not breaking the doors down. But when you know my company is only a couple dozen people, right? When the development companies are like less than 10 people, right? That is all you need, right? You get there because when your development costs are so low, you just don't have to make up for all that much in the back end. What happens with some of these AAA, you know, games, especially the AAA games that flop hard, is that these are things that have budgets in like the tens of millions of dollars. And if they can't make good on that budget, well, you're kind of SOL at that point.
Yeah, no, I mean like when a game like Hades, with Super Giant staff of 20 people sells over 1 million copies, it's doing great, and that is me
Yep.
directly calling out friend of the cast Zhao for an
Well, I do
off.
actually want to talk a little bit about that
Yeah,
because so the conversation, I didn't see this whole conversation, but the conversation was about the nature of competition, right? When it comes to you know the monopoly at the monopolistic aspect, right?
yeah.
And do you want to just like what is your point here when it comes to Supergiant and Microsoft and competition that makes you feel like Microsoft doesn't have the monopoly that it feels like it is growing?
I mean, so the specific point that was being argued was like, friend of the cast Zhao sarcastically said something like, "Well, if you don't like it, go build your own company." And it's like, well, you can, right? Like, CD Project, FromSoft, Supergiant, right? Like, there's like tons of small studios, and there was some point about like how comparable like Supergiant is to like, the giant studios. But my fundamental point is that Microsoft having all these studios doesn't crowd other creators out of the market, right? Like, games are not fungible for each other as easily, right? Like
Sure.
it's not like if freaking I don't know KitchenAid buys Cuisinart, right? Like that all the kitchen utensils are not gonna like all the high end kind of kitchen uh tools aren't gonna have competition anymore, right? Because like the food the food processor and the stand mixers will all come from one source, whatever, right? Like and you're only ever buying one of those, right? Like you're buying different games for different reasons, right? Like you will buy two different games at the same time, and play them for different reasons. So like Bastion does not directly compete with say Call of Duty as such, right? Which is
Yeah, I
what
mean, I do think that these things do compete in a micro scale, right? Which is that okay, so if Hades releases in the same weekend as Call of Duty, those two things are going head to head to a certain extent, right?
Right.
There is a certain amount of gamer attention. We could numeric we could put a number to that, which is the sum total of minutes that gamers around the world will be paying attention to gaming news, whether that's on Twitter or wherever else. And that news is going to fuel purchases, and those purchases are directly competing with one another in that sense, right? But there's also the idea of counter programming, which is like a movie term, which is that, any Friday of the year where a new movie comes out, there are going to be people who want to go see the new Marvel movie, but there are also going to be people who want to go see an adult drama, who are going to want to see a kids movie, who are going to want to see, a horror movie, right? And those people are activated by the presence of those, like of those films, right? So just because whatever Spider-Man No Way Home is coming out and is probably going to dominate the box office doesn't mean that A24 can't release its latest weird art house movie that same weekend and make a good amount of money, because there are people who would only show up to the movies that weekend because of, this specific need of theirs being serviced, right? In other words, while while Hades and Call of Duty might be going head to head in terms of just like raw, like the raw number of gamer hours being paid attention to by, in any given weekend, the overall number of those gamer hours expands because Hades is in the picture, right? There are people who do not care about shooters but do care about roguelikes, and they are going to go pick up the roguelike because it is coming out in this weekend. So I think that, and that's a complicated thing that I don't really think has an analogy anywhere else besides in media, right? Because
Yeah.
like it's not like people, nobody tracks the release of a fork against another fork, right? You know what I mean? Most products are pretty utilitarian compared to media in this way. But in that sense, I do think that, most indie games, and even most, you could make an argument that like most games of kind of different scale and different genres don't actually compete with one another that much, and therefore, Supergiant isn't really, competing all that much with
Yeah.
Microsoft,
I
because they're kind of targeting different subsets of that huge audience.
Absolutely, and you can. I think you can make like some very specific comparisons. Like I think like Battlefield pretty directly competes with COD. Like that's one of the classic
Yep.
ones, right? But like I think a lot of those are pretty few and far between. And ultimately, my kind of view on the monopoly scare around uh around this particular acquisition seems more like kind of like knee jerk reactions to general kind of apprehension around tech acquisitions and mergers than it is kind of like founded in any sort of like real, really well based concern about like the health of the gaming industry. I don't think this is particular. I don't think this is an industry that's particularly prone to monopolization or particularly dangerous if with large players. We've had large players in it for a while. Like I said,
Yep.
first of all, I think one of the bigger players is Tencent, and Tencent is like relatively recent, at least a recent entrant into like the kind of like I'm gonna say like not mainstream, but like kind of like traditional games demographic. Um,
Yeah, this reminds me a lot of when Disney bought Fox, and there were a lot of people who were kind of like, crying the death knell of traditional movie, like movie studios or whatever, right? And how it's really dangerous that Disney is sucking up, the IP or whatever. But like nobody gives credit to Netflix for breaking in to the industry,
right.
right? And
Or
so
Amazon
in a way,
Studios, right? Like
right, yeah,
you
like in a
mentioned
way
Father
you
C.
could make the argument, and I would make the argument that the appearance of Apple TV, Amazon Prime Studios, Netflix, that these are companies who are entering that space. So the idea that Fox and Disney are now merged, they are now one company, when they used to be two, really isn't all that dangerous or shocking, right? Just because of, the way in which the like media
Yeah,
as a whole has expanded to account for streaming companies.
yeah, like the more pieces of the pie too, right? Like, this isn't even
Yep.
like thinking count something that's like fairly tangential, but like still related. It's like YouTube, right?
Mhm.
Like streaming amateur video, like which anybody can do, right? Is huge, right? It's enormous, and it's encroaching on that space too. I mean, nobody wants to talk about that. Everybody just wants to
And
talk
it's
about it.
being beaten up by TikTok, right?
Yeah,
Now
no,
you have
TikTok is the
even more amateur
yeah.
short video beating out the previously shortest and amateurist of the video platforms.
Oh man, yeah. All right. Well, to bring it back to kind of like state of the industry stuff, I guess.
Sure.
Um. What do you see anything like? How do you feel like the rest of the industry is going to react to this? Right? Because like again, this is a huge acquisition. Do you see anybody making moves in relation? Do you think like one of my thoughts was like maybe Steam starts to produce its own streaming service? I don't see Steam acquiring any studios because they seem to be pretty hands off with that. But like,
Mhm.
um, maybe that becomes a little bit top of mind. Maybe Epic pivots to do its own to do something a little bit more to like maybe acquire more studios instead of just paying for releases, stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts?
My core thing is I think I remember so Microsoft said that they're gonna make the first quadruple A game, right? That the first quadruple A game is gonna come out. And I sort of think that what we're seeing is the creation of the quadruple A gaming publisher, right? We've sort of typically had triple A gaming publishers. We can name a bunch of them, right? But I think that now with Tencent and with Microsoft, and maybe in the future, and I would also put Amazon in here, but I think they just suck at it. Um, there's probably going to be a tier above the typical AAA producer, and I would not be surprised if typical AAA producers get gobbled up by this, right? Take Two is another example of this, but I think the biggest one is Square Enix. I think if I'm putting money on something, I think Sony buys Square Enix at some point, right?
I can see that.
Um, maybe obviously they're both Japanese companies. They've had very tight relations for years and years and years. Um, 14 is exclusive to the PlayStation. There's a lot of Final Fantasy exclusive stuff on the PlayStation. I'm sure that they have just like a really great rapport. The one question is like, is Sony as healthy a company as Microsoft? I feel like the answer is probably no. I mean, I know it's definitely one of the biggest companies in Japan, but I don't get the sense that Sony is making enough money off of its like, I don't know, TVs, right? That it can just pick up Square Enix out of the blue in the same way that Microsoft can just pick up Activision. But I feel like what we will see is the Bethesdas, the Take-Twos, the Square Enixes, they will be slowly absorbed by these kind of quadruple A publishers. And we will kind of live in a world where, I don't know, maybe Facebook buys EA or something kind of along those lines. And all of a sudden, the AAA publisher kind of gets subsumed into this quadruple A state.
Yeah, yeah. So that's an interesting point. Sorry, I was looking at. Looks like Sony's revenue is like 81 billion, which is nothing to sneeze at.
It's about
Uh,
half of what Microsoft
yeah,
is.
yeah.
So yeah, like that to me feels like, I don't know, what is
I'm also
Square
seeing
Enix's
2.37
revenue?
trillion, but maybe that's like yuan, which seems, uh, yeah. No, it's got to be 81. Yeah. But anyway, to your point, I think
Wow. Yeah. See, okay, so Square Enix's revenue is 332 billion, which is 2.8 billion dollars. Like that seems to me like there's a clear order of magnitude between Sony and between Square Enix, and I would not be surprised if Square Enix gets scooped up.
so. The thing that popped in my mind is like, can Sony like acquire Nintendo, which would be which would be nice.
I mean, that would be crazy. Nintendo definitely does feel like it is up for grabs, though, right? Because it's exactly in the space that I'm talking about. You have Nintendo, Ubisoft. Maybe you have sort of these like double two AAA publishers, Paradox, for instance. I wouldn't be surprised if Paradox got picked up by somebody in the next couple of years, just because it feels like they are a pretty healthy and growing company all over.
Yeah, yeah. Nintendo looks like it's 15 billion, thousand million. Yeah, 15 billion in revenue, which is
That's quite a lot, actually.
it is, but it's
So
nothing to sneeze at, right? Like,
yeah.
um, I mean, it's definitely acquirable, right? Like
Mm.
it's within somebody's grasp if somebody really wanted to go out there.
Yeah, if Mark Zuckerberg wants to cut a deal, I'm sure like, I'm sure you could buy Nintendo for the
Yeah,
fucking metaverse.
Yeah, I mean,
What
so
a cursed thought.
there might be some things in there that would prevent that from happening, just kind of like Japanese cultural mores, right?
Yeah,
Like I don't
absolutely.
think they get acquired by a company that isn't Japanese, because I just don't think they'd be like, no, I don't care. We're not letting Zuckerberg acquire it because he is not a good solid Japanese company, right? Like,
Yep.
and their government might not even let them. I could see that
Yeah,
happening, but
it is worth noting that, when these big acquisitions have been made, they have been made in sort of moments of weakness, right?
yeah,
Bobby Kotick has this gigantic scandal, and that's when Phil Spencer's like, "Oh, look at you." You know what I mean? The same thing happened with Take-Two because they also had a huge, gigantic crunch scandal. Not last year. Maybe it was last year. Maybe it was early last year, but just around the production of Grand Theft Auto, right? Like they were the centerpiece of the crunch is bad, actually, controversy, right? And what was the other big one? Oh, Bethesda. Well,
yeah.
Bethesda, the guy died.
Robert
I
Trump
can't remember
died.
that. Yeah, he died. He died. And so it's like all of a sudden, okay, well, like these are companies that you could see getting sold off, right? But I don't get the sense that like Nintendo is a weak enough company
Yeah,
that it is in a position where somebody could leverage them for a buyout like that.
yeah. If that was gonna happen, that would have happened during the Wii U period, right? They're very strong during the Switch period.
Yeah.
Um, but unwinding a bit. To your point about AAA versus quadruple A, I've always thought like I think what that's going to be is maybe more of a formalization of a separation that I think was already there, which is kind of like AAA versus kind of like 2.5A is going to get like just stretched out again, right? Because like something like Dark Souls, right, retails at full price, but is also significantly less polished than something like a Call of Duty. And so
Yeah, I get that.
like I feel like the range of AAA is gonna spread and like move a little bit differently. And then quadruple, like I think you could call Call of Duty a quadruple A title right now if you really wanted to. But I think like you definitely call it that with the Microsoft iteration. And I think that because it's effectively a marketing term at that point, you have people calling them quadruple A's regardless of like what real difference there is there, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
like to me, I feel like you have a single A or an indie publisher should be like me, like Akupara,
Yeah.
right? Then you have a double A publisher. And that's something like Devolver or Paradox sits in this world. There's also a couple of other ones in here that are at that level, right? But like you might not necessarily have heard of them, right? Maybe Tiny Build is in there, for instance. Then I think you have the traditional AAA, right? You got, yeah,
Capcom,
this doesn't even have to be the big one. This is, yeah, exactly. Capcom,
Bamco.
Ubisoft, there's a bunch of these, right? Sega is in here. And then to me, there is that quadruple A level, which is where you get Microsoft, you know, or
Well, I think
just
ABK would
like
have been there like before this anyway, right? Like,
yeah, well, yeah, that's true, right? It's just like the top end of the AAA feels like it is its own category at this
yeah,
point, right? It was not weird when Activision bought Blizzard, for instance, or bought King. And all of a sudden it is now Activision Blizzard, King, right? Or even, there are other examples of this, but I can't think of any off the top of my head of just like, big giant mergers between publishing, like game publishing companies. Obviously Squaresoft and Enix turning into Square Enix is another example of this, but that was like 20
I
years
mean,
ago at this point.
like EA has been like acquiring and killing companies for decades, right? Like that's
Yeah,
like the
that's
big
true.
meme, right?
Yeah.
Like not Bioshock, BioWare and like Midway and Respawn, right? Like all which like kind of sort of exist now in like zombie forms of what they were. Um, uh, so it's not like this is like super unusual. It just hasn't happened as rapidly, right? Like Microsoft has really made a strong play in the past couple of years.
Yeah,
Uh,
just like looking at it, the number of EA acquisitions, it far outstrips the number of Microsoft acquisitions, right? The number of Microsoft acquisitions was like a block of a huge page of all of the things they've acquired. It's just this one tiny subcategory, but EA has like they've acquired a lot of stuff over the years. They really wanted um to pick up a bunch of stuff, right? PopCap, who the Plants vs Zombies people, Respawn, Industrial Toys is actually kind of the big one. They're a mobile game uh producer. Metalhead Software was recent. I don't know who that is. But it's just like it feels like they are constantly, going out and picking up these game development studios. to kind of like add to their umbrella.
So Metalhead is based in Vancouver.
Oh, they make EA Sports. They
Uh,
make the baseball games apparently. Super Mega Baseball.
huh. Interesting. Super Mega Baseball. Yeah, it's not like real baseball. It's not like licensed baseball. I assume. Yeah, yeah. It's kind of cartoony baseball. Interesting. Um, but yeah. Huh. Yeah, because EA Sports just yeah. So yeah, it's not that like, but like the difference is EA's picked up some big movers like BioWare, right? But like
Mhm.
nothing at the level of like a Zenimax. Because like it wasn't just Bethesda, right? It was all of Zenimax, right?
Yep,
Which is
that
like
included Arcane, who's the studio behind most recently Deathloop,
Deathloop
but
and Dishonored. Yeah.
Dishonored is the thing they're famous for, right? It also included more stuff. I can't remember who else is in the Zenimax.
Well, Zenimax is Elder Scrolls Online, Zenimax Studios. Um,
Yeah.
so
Well,
now they've got
that was they made that entirely for uh Elder Scrolls. Like they created the Zenimax studio to make the Elder Scrolls.
yeah.
That wasn't an acquisition of theirs.
Oh, right. I mean, because
Oh, id. That is
oh, id,
I was
right,
like, there's
yeah.
another one. Yeah, so they picked up id at some point.
Well, it was under Zenimax. Oh, yeah, yes. Zenimax picked up
Yeah,
id.
that's what I mean to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so yeah, but picking up Bethesda is kind of like a bigger deal just because it had all of these like little, kind of component pieces. I would actually expect that Ubisoft also would work that way, but Ubisoft tends to like rebrand everything to a different version of Ubisoft, right? There's Ubisoft Montreal, there's the Ubisoft offices in France, whatever they're called.
I think those are those are the primary ones.
Yeah, and it's just like and they have like different, different spots, right? I think the Assassin's Creed games come out of Ubisoft Montreal, but then there are other Ubisoft games that come out of different other sort of like locations around the world, but all of that stuff gets rebranded as Ubisoft.
Yeah. That's that's just something that occurred to me is like Bethesda and Epic were both based in the Maryland area while we were at Hopkins. Um, like
Really?
apparently, yeah. Well, so
Well,
so
Epic is from North Carolina now, or they are based in North
so
Carolina now.
Tim Sweeney came and talked in Baltimore like our freshman year.
Hmm,
Yeah, I think he might have talked to the AC. I don't remember if he came to the ACM directly, but there was definitely a talk downtown that a bunch of people went to that he was talking at. Because Epic
sure.
Games was still important. It just wasn't, Fortnite important at that point in time. And Bethesda was based in Bethesda, Maryland, right? Like that's why the Fallout 3 map is like, so true to the capital area, right? Like
Yep.
um uh so interesting that like there's like a bunch of stuff in that kind of that kind of part of the country, which you don't normally think of as being associated with game stuff. Uh, yeah. Um, but we said this was gonna be state of the industry, mostly focused on this Activision Blizzard thing because we didn't think we could fill a whole hour about the Activision
Yeah,
Blizzard
we did.
thing.
We were like, I don't think we could fill a whole hour on this. Which, to be fair, we branched off into a lot of other pieces. The last thing that I want to mention, obviously, is just like indie games, right? Because this is the thing
Yeah.
that I'm closest to the ground on. And I don't remember if we ever talked about this, but it feels as though indie games are growing every single year, which makes plenty of sense. The thing that I think was interesting about indie games that was predicted by the extra credits people was it was the idea that when gaming became a college thing, that people go to college and they learn game design, right? That was going to fuel this huge explosion of indie games because that's what happened in film, right? You had in like the 70s, or actually earlier than that, in the 60s, film schools kind of crop up and film gets like this thing, and then all of a sudden now you have all of these filmmakers spilling out into the world, and independent films became a bigger and bigger deal as just like the industry had to compensate for that expansion. And I feel like we're kind of in the middle of that when it comes to indie games coming out and being bigger and sort of like better than ever. The interesting thing about indie games is that some of them will always blow up, and the ones that do are just like insane. Like if you imagine Among Us, right? The studio that made Among Us must have just an insane amount of money right now because of how hard that game blew up overnight, right? And in a world where Supergiant is another great example of this, because they sold that many copies of Hades. It's like, well, yeah, fucking a 20-person company, that's going to be gigantic, right? But there's a lot of success in the margins that I don't think people quite realize, or are necessarily like paying attention to. I have a weird window into this because I pay attention to a lot of Total War YouTubers, but the Total War YouTubers will like expose me to this entirely separate side of the industry, right? That I'm paying practically zero attention to, but it's actually kind of fucking huge, right? Like city builders and management simulations are just like this gigantic piece of the gaming puzzle, that isn't really well established or talked about, right? There isn't a ton of interest in that sort of thing when it comes to sort of like your typical gaming platforms. But like, yeah, there are plenty of companies and games coming out in this
Are you
in
laughing at my
this
water bottle?
for folks at home, I think I just took a gigantic swig. Is that thing a gallon? It is huge.
It is.
What the fuck? You have a gallon of water next to your desk?
You know why I got this?
Is it because of Josh?
It's because of Josh.
Oh
I'm sorry, I didn't derail the conversation.
Holy shit. Oh my god, that's fucking funny. Oh my god, I'm dying. I'm dying. That was so big. Oh, woo.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I
What
don't mean to derail
were
you.
we talking about? Oh my god. Indie games or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, there's just like there's so many pockets and corners to gaming, right? Where a game can come out and make $250,000, and that is enough to feed your family for a couple of years, right? While you work on a sequel, and then the sequel is going to come up and it's going to be just as successful, right? A game that I was paying a little bit of attention to recently, was god, what is it called? Expeditions Rome, right? Is this new historical tactics RPG that's coming out, right? And apparently it's the third in a series that I've just never fucking heard of, right? And it's the Expedition series, but these games are really successful. And it's just like, no one in my whole life has ever mentioned to me, oh, have you ever played the Expedition series or whatever? But like, there's 3 of them, and it's because, indie games are kind of fucking thriving, I guess.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, it's easy to publish, right? Like you can publish
yeah.
on, and it's kind of like like there are boutique indie publishers like Akupara,
Yep.
Devolver, and a handful of others like you said, Tiny Build, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean,
um,
we are part of a group called the Indie Houses, which is 7 different publishers. Among them is like Whitethorn. They used to be, I think they're Whitethorn Games. They used to be Whitethorn Digital. Toga Productions, who are out of Indonesia, who we know really well, and they do Coffee Talk is like the game that people recognize from them. The Fellow Traveler guys really focus on indie narrative experiences, right? So like that's their big thing, is that they only publish like really story forward games, and all of their fans are kind of aligned in this, like, we just want to play like the best kind of story experiences, right? Raw Fury is another example. There's a million of these, right?
yeah.
We could name them all day, but I just think that if you're the kind of gamer, even if you're the kind of gamer that listens to this podcast and hears me talk about Warcraft every week because it's the big game that I'm playing a lot of, I actually think that that there's just like a lot more to the industry than people realize. Just because it's a big tent. There's room for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Not much else you can like. Yeah, like, and that's great. That's what makes the hobby so compelling, right? It's like you can go from like playing, I don't know, what was I playing? Playing like Grime, to playing something like World of Warcraft, which is 14 years old and like knows it. But yeah, that's about the end of our hour, buddy. How was your week?
You know, that's a good question. I played a full work week of Factorio. That's what I did all week. Every day, Rachel came home and we played so much fucking Factorio that by the end of the week, we had a new save file with 40 hours in it. And I was like, oh my God, I worked a week in Factorio.
I hope
Have you
you had
have you
fun.
ever played Factorio? I know I've talked about it on the podcast, but have you ever actually
I
played
have.
Factorio?
I played
Okay.
it right around the 1.0 release for a
Okay,
while.
yeah, so that's why we came back to it, was because it had come out in 1.0. We wanted to see the difference because we had played the game maybe 2 years ago, but it was still in early access and it was not, it was mostly feature complete at that point, right? Like there was a whole tree and everything, but they just kept adding new stuff over the years and they changed some stuff. I was surprised that it was basically the same that I remember. Like a lot of my memory for, oh, how did we make this thing was the exact same, right? When we wanted to get to uh when we wanted to get to robots, for instance, robots had the exact same recipe as before. But there was some new stuff, like there was nuclear power stuff that was different. Also, when I played, you had to do a thing with oil that was very different. The way that you did oil back then was you had to make a barrel, and then in an assembler you pumped oil into the barrel, and then you took that barrel and it was an item that you could move between chests and stuff, and you put the barrel on your train, and then your train went back to the barrel, and then it went into assemblers where it dumped out the oil into a fluid system, which was a way more complicated version of, now there's just pumps and a fluid wagon that is a tank, and you just pump the oil into a tank and pump it back out of a tank. So stuff like that. But it is just such a good game to like really get like lost into. Um and I don't really have anything more complicated than that. What
Very good. Yeah, yeah. As for my week, I played some Guilty Gear Strive for fun. I mean, why else would play it? But it's still as great as ever. Weirdly enough, I haven't been playing any of the DLC characters, which are like Happy Chaos and Gold Lewis and um, Valentine, or Jacko, not Valentine, Jacko. And there's a new one coming out too, Biken. Um, but I haven't really seen them being played either, right? Like it's not like I've had any matches against them, which is interesting because I can't really get used to them if I don't play against them. But I know that I know Happy Chaos is supposed to be pretty strong. He's got a gun, and basically his game plan is it doesn't like you have to do moves to like increase the accuracy or something. I don't quite understand. I need to go blab him just to understand what the mechanic is. But apparently he's pretty powerful. But it's been a good time. I've also past couple of weeks, which you've missed out on, which has been disappointing. We've been playing Crusader Kings. This week went a lot better than last week. Where last week I accidentally died from cancer within the first 10 minutes and dissolved the Bulgarian Empire into the Byzantine Empire. Much to everybody's chagrin. We played the later start, the 1167 start maybe. And
Okay.
we played in France. I played as a tiny little count. And then we all variously played different things. This is right around when William the Conqueror starts doing his thing. And it was a ton of fun. Unfortunately, a friend of the cast, Nick, got kind of unceremoniously crapped on by this circumstances.
And was he in that position? I've been in this position before where you're playing in the online game and where you're playing in the online game and you just you're getting destroyed by RNG and the AI, but you can't leave the game because everyone else is having a good time, even though you're fucking miserable. Was that Nick's experience?
He held on for a little while, and then he was like, I'm done, and he dropped out. Because so what happened
My heart
was
goes out to you, Nick. I've been there.
he got deposed, and so he was playing as a count of a single he went from the Duke to the Count state,
Okay.
and then he attempted an independence war, and he didn't account for something, or um maybe there was a simultaneous fight with William the Conqueror, because he was the neighbor to him, and just totally screwed him out of that war too. He's like, well, fuck, and he's like, I can't do this anymore, and he dropped. Um, but part of that kind of thing is I get it, right? And so, I don't know how much CK3 you've played, but the hot joining is really great, right? Like when I died out in the game last week, like I game over, I could just pick somebody else and go for it, right? Because you're not like playing Iron Man or anything.
That is a really awesome feature,
Yeah,
and I think is like one of the cool things.
or like one of our friends, friend of the cast, John, he had to like drop to like go eat dinner. And he went and ate dinner. And he came back and he just hot joined again, and he picked his player again. It was relatively seamless. It's great.
Was he mad because the AI fucked up his that's happened to us with Stellaris games, right? Like if somebody isn't there to play the AI will play your empire for a little bit, and then you come back into it, you're like, what the fuck?
You know what the AI did with his empire, with his
Oh
country,
my
or
god,
the
what
dukedom?
happened?
He attacked Nick. This is what started.
No.
This is what started Nick's downward spiral.
Oh my god, that is honestly one of the funniest things. That is like the perfect story for one of these like Crusader Kings nights. Oh my god, holy shit.
Yeah, no, it was super fun, and I hope one of these nights you can join us, because it's fun to just like chill out and like uh you know conquer conquer some stuff, do some stuff, maybe start declaring some crusades at some point, right?
Yeah, it's funny. So a friend of mine went to therapy recently, and her therapist, and her thing is she has like a ton of side hustles, right? Like she has like a day job, but basically like anything else that she does in her free time is like an Etsy store, or right, like it is something that she has turned into a gig essentially. And her therapist was like, you need to find a hobby that you can't monetize, because like it's just stressing you the fuck out, because you take all of the things that are supposed to be relaxing, you turn them into fucking work. And so her thing is she's getting back into WoW, which I was like, that's the perfect hobby, right? For this kind of, just to do something, to watch number go up, to feel, oh, good job, I completed a quest, like I completed this little goal or whatever, right? And I think that Crusader Kings or Factorio, right? Like all of these hit in that exact same place, right? The thing that was just like electric about Factorio when Rachel and I started playing was just like because the core of that game is like building out the bottom of the production tree, right? There's always a bigger issue. There's like, oh, well, I need to make more circuits. But my circuits are consuming too much copper. Let me go redo my whole copper intake system. It's like, I'm gonna have to add on 10 more, steel furnaces to keep up with production or whatever. It's just like it is this constantly expanding kind of fluid goal, and then completion of goal loop that is just like so addicting, right? Um, then it makes for like a perfect Sunday.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to me.
Excuse me.
In addition to playing Guilty Gear, and the other stuff, I watched two movies. I watched Pupel of Chimney Town, which is like a Japanese children's movie. It's like the 3D. It's like an anime style, but like that 3D anime style, and it's got a unique look to it. Um, it's like I said, it's very through and through a children's movie, but it's very charming and very uh, you know, it's good for what it is. Like I wouldn't like race out to see it again, but like if you have a kid or like a nephew that wants to see something charming and doesn't mind reading subtitles, Propel of Chimney Town's pretty good. Um, and I also saw The Last Duel, which was an interesting movie. It
I
based
haven't seen it yet, but I really want to. I know it just hit HBO Max
that's
over the weekend, I think.
this is why we watched it. My brother was up to visit me, and he wanted to watch it, so we sat down and we watched it. Just this kind of like light, no spoilers stuff is like it's kind of a Rashomon style story about what it was historically known as the last duel. It wasn't technically the last one; it was the last one at the era of duels. And it centers around a duel over the alleged rape of the movie's main female character. Um, and I thought it was all right. It did some interesting stuff. Um, but I also thought that it went on a little bit long. I thought it was a little bit long in the tooth. Um, I don't think it like I wouldn't say it was bad, but like, and if you want to watch it, I would say go ahead. I wouldn't say avoid it, but I don't think I'll be watching it again. The comparison I like the comparison that I made in my head is like I don't know if I think it's a worse movie than Matrix Resurrections, but I would watch Matrix Resurrections again, and I would not watch this movie again.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, and like, there are some fight scenes, and the fight scenes are really well done. It's not the main thrust of the movie, but you know, it's medieval combat, and it feels real medieval. So you know, I soft recommendation, like you know, take it or leave it. I guess if you've got a night and you want to watch something on HBO Max, you could do worse.
Yeah, I feel like I've been watching a lot of stuff recently. Like there was a while where I was trolling through. Yeah, do you ever think about like The Simpsons? This like occurred to me the other day. Like The Simpsons has been going on for 30 years. Like The Simpsons is as old as I am. Do you?
I
Yeah, I guess not. Okay, I
no,
think
sorry.
about that. But like, because I was watching American Dad, right, which came out in 2005, right? It came out during the Bush administration and was making fun of that era of conservatism. But like, eventually, American Dad kind of came into its own as a like broader sort of like pop culture parody. They would do these riff episodes that were on, like that was like one episode that they did was it was a Vietnam War movie, but the idea was that it was a Vietnam War reenactment, but it was structured and shot essentially like, Rambo or Full Metal Jacket or Apocalypse Now or any of those movies, right? And that's the court joke, right? But and so I think it fits pretty neatly in. We've talked about this with like 30 Rock Community, these kind of irreverent, like hyper real, not quite reality, and willing to sort of like bend the rules of reality to sort of comment on like genre fiction itself, right? It is deeply entrenched in that version of things or whatever. And I as I entered the 15th season, I was just like, holy fucking shit. There are a lot of episodes of this television show. And then I also watched all of Gracie and Frankie because I hadn't finished Grace and Frankie, and they made a new season, and that show continues to befuddle me, but in a very interesting and fun way, because it is a show about old people and very much for old people. Like it is a sitcom that is making fun of like problems that old people face and make these whole episodes out of conflicts that I just cannot in my entire world empathize with, right? Like there's one episode where both Grace and Frankie throw out their backs trying to get one another up off the ground, and are just stuck on the floor like crawling around the house. And I'm sure if I was an old man I would find this incredibly funny. But I was just like along for that ride. Uh and so that's the kind of stuff that I've been like watching recently. Oh, alongside Westworld, we talked about this. Because the new season of Westworld is coming up at some point. Something that I thought was really interesting was the television and film critic at Vox, Emily Vanderwerf, I think is her name. It published an article about like the decline of the mystery box television show, of which Westworld is like firmly among the number, which is like these television shows that essentially exist to be like little puzzles for people on Reddit to solve and theorize about, and what's happening next, what's coming up next or whatever. And about how the most recent season of a show called Yellow Jackets, or I think the first season of a show called Yellow Jackets, is kind of subverting that, because there are mysteries to the show, but the mysteries are just what they are on their face. There's no trickery. It's not trying to make some mystery for you to solve and decipher. It is just, the person who seems pretty sketchy turned out to be the bad guy, right? The reason that somebody does this thing is the reason that they say in the first episode, that kind of a thing. Which I thought was interesting, because like I feel like for a while, Game of Thrones was like this, Westworld is like this, Lost is probably the first of these, which are just these like shows. I don't know, maybe the first of these is the X-Files, right? Which has a whole, underpinning plot about a conspiracy regarding aliens in the United States government. I just feel like that stuff is I don't know.
Yeah, I think part of that has died because we've moved on to like entire seasons getting dumped at once, right? Like so it's not the week to week kind of like around the water cooler discussion of what's happening, right? Because like arguably like the earliest one of these would maybe be Twin Peaks, right? Like,
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think maybe the first iteration of this is Dallas. Do you know Dallas? Who shot Jr. Right? Like
yeah,
that's obviously a famous thing, right? They ended on this cliffhanger, and
everybody talked about it all
and
summer.
everybody talked about it all summer because they wanted to figure out who shot Jr. Right? That was in 1980, I think.
But that's also like not the show, right? That was just like the season-ending cliffhanger,
Yeah.
uh, which had I think slightly wider adoption. Like kind of like come back next season for whatever. Um,
Mm.
uh, but kind of along lines of like shows with a lot of episodes. I finished 30 Rock because I didn't
How did
realize.
you enjoy? Did you think it ended well?
I thought it did fine. I didn't think it was bad. Um, you know, I had seen the ending scene before and I hadn't realized it. Just because like
What is the ending scene? I'm sorry.
Alec Baldwin going out on his yacht for like 30 seconds and then like he has an idea and like he's like, I'm out to sail until I figure out my next thing, right? And then like he leaves port and then like 30 seconds later he just shouts at Liz Lemon, dishwashers that are transparent so you can see what's happening inside. He comes back in. He's like, and then like it goes into kind of like an epilogue, um, with him at GE and her having kids who are mirrors of Jenna and Tracy, and then it does the St. Elmo's thing. I think it's St. Elmo's. The snow globe thing, and it zooms out, and it's Liz Lemon's granddaughter pitching 30 Rock to Kenneth Parcells, who has been hinted at over the course of the show being immortal.
To be immortal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that's good. Yeah, that was St. Elmo's, right? Where it's all in the there was a website that was famous, that was made by a famous comics writer, Dwayne McDuffie. Or maybe it wasn't made by him, but he talked about it that like it's like everything in Tim something's head. God, what is it? Now I want to know.
Well, it's because that show had a bunch of crossovers, right? And so you could cross over out, and then that show turns out to be in the imagination of like the mentally challenged kid. Um, um,
Fuck, what the fuck is it? Tommy Westfall is his name. Everything in Tommy Westfall's head. Because there is a yeah, okay, yeah, and then the Tommy Westfall universe, which was postulated by Dwayne McDuffie, who's a very famous comics writer. He's like the guy that made like Static Shock, for instance. And he made a huge, gigantic web. By the way, the thing is Saint Elsewhere, apparently. He made this huge, gigantic web of all of these TV shows that are in the Tommy Westfall um crossover universe, because like like characters from Law and Order will cross over to characters from The Wire, and the character in The Wire is now, and like all of these other things.
right, because St. Elsewhere was at a time when you would have a lot of crossovers, and so like they crossed over, and then like those shows have their own crossovers, right? And so like the web kind of goes ever outwards.
Yeah, so an example of the crossover is St. Elsewhere characters Dr. Roxanne Turner and Dr. Victor Ehrlich appeared on Homicide: Life on the Street, which is the show that what's that guy's name? David Simon? Made before he made The Wire, and then characters from Homicide: Life on the Street cross over into The Wire and into Law and Order because Law and Order creator Dick Wolf is friends with um uh whoever, another guy. And so it's just like all of that stuff will blossom out into a million things. So everything is taking place inside of Tommy Westfall's head.
That reminded me of like a great joke from 30 Rock, which is like Kenneth being like, you can't say things like Dick Wolf on television.
Yeah.
Lou points out it's Detective Munch that crosses over.
Oh my God, I forgot about chat. I haven't looked at chat all day.
Yeah, Lou
Detective Munch, my favorite SVU detective. Yeah.
Shit TV fan. Yeah, I think Munch had like a relatively small part in The Wire. I have not watched The Wire, so feel
You
free.
haven't watched The Wire?
No,
God, you lived in Baltimore.
I know.
And you must have heard that fucking constantly.
I did because apparently, like I walked out of the liquor store on Charles Street, and one of a friend said that like the female lead was in there. This is like right at the height of it too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, The Wire is kind of like a loose recreation of Homicide: Life on the Streets, right? Like Homicide is not a direct like one-to-one, but it is a mostly like straightforward procedural, like police procedural, right? And then The Wire is a procedural that is like that is like fictionalized, but they are from the same source material of
What,
being
Baltimore being terrible?
yeah. Hold on. Now I want to like look at this. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the series was based on David Simon's book Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets, right? So the Homicide: Life on the Street is based on that book, and then David Simon would then go on to be the showrunner on The Wire, right? So he sort of fictionalized his own book to explain, I guess, that whole interaction.
Yeah. But yeah, that I think that's all the big things I did with my week. Yeah, I mean I played some D&D, but I do that every week now, which has been fun. Pathfinder 2e is pretty great. Oh, that's some big news. Mark Seifter is leaving Paizo for Roll for Combat, which is like now like a third party publisher they're doing like it's called the Battles of Bestiary for 1 for 5, like it's got versions for 5e and PF2e. But he's gonna be like one of their like creative leads. And he's gonna freelance for Paizo. So that's
wow, I did not know that. That is actually kind of nuts. I mean, Paizo had its own. Were you tracking any of that stuff with Paizo?
Yeah,
They
Paizo
had their own
Contra
sort of
for Z. Yeah.
yeah, there was a huge thing about that that I dug into more for the drama than anything else. I was just down, because there were a lot of people who were like ex-collaborators of Paizo that had since like left the company who kind of came out and talked about kind of the high level editorial team being like shitty to work with or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's insane. Wow.
I know that like in kind of his like goodbye post on the Paizo forums, he was like, "There'll be less crunch at battles or at Roll for Combat." Although apparently that company is basically like living off of the creators' savings for the time being. Like it is not like the first product is coming out, but like it got kickstarted, but there's they're not like rolling yet, so there's only so long.
Interesting.
Yeah. But I think that's everything I had. You want to talk about anything else before we get out of here?
Do I want to talk about anything else before we get out of here? Not really. We have raids soon. I don't know, man. What I have nothing else I'm talking about. This is the state of the industry. There you go.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you'd like to email us about your thoughts about anything we talked about today, whether that's the state of the industry or the ABK merger or the ABK Microsoft merger or any other things we talked about this podcast, you should send derpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@derpsplaygames.com. You'll follow us on twitch.tv derpsplaygames where these shows go out live and you could watch me drink out of giant water bottles live. And rate, review us on iTunes, anywhere you find podcasts, do all the stuff. Links are in the description. That's everything I have. Buddy, you have anything you want to promote?
I have nothing else I'm looking to promote this week.
Well, in that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners. I feel so bad that I didn't pay attention to chat that whole time.
Yeah, no, Lou had some comments and I couldn't slip them in because I'm not as good at getting them in naturally. Lou said, "Truly the biggest draw is the gallon truck." Very funny.
Oh God. I'm actually pretty excited to do Old Noir just because I have a pretty powerful time walking set. I did the time walking what's it called, braid? Oh, I'm sorry, I just walked away from my microphone.
I can hear you.
I did the time walking Burning Crusade.